Welcome to the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. My name is Julia Rothkopf, and I'm the Program Associate at YIVO. Today, we have Gali Drucker-Bar-Am and Barbara Mann joining us for a discussion about representations of the Israeli experience in Yiddish prose, 1948 to 1967. And it's about this book, I Am Your Dust. For those who do not know YIVO, we are a very special place for the celebration, contemplation, and exploration of Yiddish and Eastern European Jewish culture. We are located in New York City, where our library and archive contain over 24 million documents and 400,000 books. And these resources are used by researchers from all around the world. There's lots of classes on Yiddish language and culture, exhibitions, and public programs just like this one, where we aim to bridge the worlds of Jewish culture and our vast library and archival collections. So now to introduce our speakers, Gali Drucker-Bar-Am is a scholar of modern Yiddish culture, notably its contribution to the formation of modern and post-World War II Jewish and Israeli subjective and collective identities. Her work closely interacts with wider studies of the modern experience, most notably studies of migration, exile cultures, of genocide and trauma, and of the emergence of modern ideologies and political movements, as well as their influence on the collective ethos of space, place, tradition, and memory. She teaches the art of teaching literature at the Levinsky-Wingate Academic Center in Tel Aviv. And Barbara E. Mann is the inaugural holder of the Stephen H. Hoffman Professorship in Modern Hebrew Language and Literature at Case Western Reserve University. She is the author of A Place in History, Modernism, Tel Aviv, and the Creation of Jewish Urban Space, Space and Place at Jewish Studies, and The Object of Jewish Literature, A Material History. She's a director of the NEH Summer Institute in June 2025 called Between Memory and the Archive, Jewish Print Culture, which is an immersive 2-week seminar, and applications will be opened shortly in December. It will take place at both YIVO and the Rochester Institute of Technology. And now I will hand it over to our panelists, and thank you for joining us.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you, first of all, to the YIVO staff. You guys are such a class act. You really, you do fabulous work day in and day out. And I'm always it's really an honor for me always to be up here with your logos and your people. I'm especially delighted today to be in conversation with Gali Drucker-Bar-Am about the English translation of her wonderful book, I Am Your Dust, Representations of the Israeli Experience in Yiddish Prose, 1948 to 1967. Gali and I first met about 10 years ago, I would say, at a special a seminar at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem. The topic was landscape in Israeli and Palestinian culture. And, we had a number of really interesting conversations there about the beginnings of this project. And so it's just really very moving for me to see it a decade later. First, the Hebrew book, which, won all kinds of awards when it came out. And now this beautiful English language translation, which is so important to make it available for a wider readership. So I'm going to turn it over to Gali, and she tells us about a half an hour or so of a presentation. She has graciously agreed that I may gently interrupt on occasion to ask her to, and I might not, but maybe I will. And then after that, I'll have just some follow-ups and some observations of my own on the book, and then we will open it to the webinar audience. So again, thank you everyone for being here. And without further ado, I'm going to ask Gali to share her screen and share her words of wisdom.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Barbara. Here, I'm sharing my screen and I'm going. Okay. Shalom Aleichem. I'm excited and honored to be here with you today. YIVO, as we all know, holds profound significance for anyone who has an interest in Yiddish culture. My grandmother, Chashke Novodvorsky, was a Yiddish teacher in Warsaw, Buenos Aires, and Tel Aviv, and a Bundist. Long story. She studied in Vilna during the high point of liberal Jewish culture between the two world wars. For her, YIVO represented the quintessence of Jewish cultural aspirations. She would be very proud and pleased had she known I stand here today. I am sincerely grateful for this invitation. I would like to thank Julia Rothkopf for her kind coordinating of today's event, and Professor Barbara Mann for agreeing to be my host. Like her, I too study the intricate relationships between place, space, and collective memory in the formation of post-war Jewish identities. We both studied Tel Aviv as a budding metropolis in which a new Jewish cultural sphere attempts to strike roots. And we both share a great interest in Yizker books, as vehicles of trauma processing and as spaces where narratives of the past have been negotiated by communities of mourners. I would also like to extend my appreciation to the editors of Olamot Center, Irit Dekel, Jason Mukhtarian, and Noam Zadov, for choosing to include my book in their fantastic series, and to the Indiana University Press team for their masterful handling of my manuscript. I'm greatly indebted to Avrom Novelstern, Eli Lederendler, and Richie Cohen of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I should also like to extend my gratitude to Rafi Weichart, Chaim Goldgraber, and Natalie Meltzer for their invaluable expertise and advice. Finally, a great big thank you and a hug to my father-in-law, Micha Bar-Am, for granting me permission to use this beautiful image in the cover of my book. It seems to me that this past year signifies a great loss for most of my listeners tonight. We lost the almost trivial sense of being at home in our lives, in our society, in our community. Something has profoundly shaken, both in Israel and globally. Familiar places become uncanny, eerie, and even turn to dust. Reality has become so surreal that it seems almost improper to celebrate the birth of a book. Yet preparing it for publication has offered me both refuge and comfort. For it studies the works and institutional infrastructures created by Holocaust survivors and their attempts to rebuild and even develop their almost extinct culture. Their convictions that we cannot escape hope has inspired me deeply. My research of Yiddish culture in newborn Israel began with a sense of awe at the resourcefulness of Yiddish-speaking Holocaust survivors in Israel. Israel was, simultaneously for them, a promised land at the end of a long and inconceivably harsh war, as well as a place that seemed to demand from them the impossible, that they relinquish their identities and leave behind their culture as well as its means of expression. And so they were forced to simultaneously process their losses, their trauma, while protecting their culture and redefining its uniqueness vis-a-vis the prevalent ethos, which failed to recognize its place. They established an impressive number of cultural institutions, the story of which are told in detail in my book. They did so while seeking to redefine and exact their unique voice and its contribution to the overall artistic activity in Israel. In short, they offered a new form of Zionism. What surprised me deeply was that the story of these Yiddish-speaking Holocaust survivors and the cultural center that they founded was largely untold. It is conspicuously absent from the dominant hegemonic cultural history of Israel. As a graduate student, for example, I took a course titled Israeli Literature in the 1950s and 1960s. The works we read were all written in Hebrew. The message of my professors was clear. Israeli literature was by and large synonymous with literature written in Hebrew in the geographic plane called Israel. This landscape was studied as if it were monolingual and homogeneous. We didn't study even a single work written by Israeli writers in languages other than Hebrew, let alone works written by non-Jewish writers. But young as I was, I knew a different reality. I grew up in a housing project in Rishon LeZion, then a small satellite town of Tel Aviv. The projects were like a vast acoustic echo chamber. You could hear everyone, a symphony of sounds, everywhere you went. Conversations on the pavement's bench, radio broadcasts from other countries, singing, children playing, mothers calling to them, the hum of washing machines, and the tapping of my mother's typewriter. And there were languages: Hebrew, Yiddish, Spanish, Arabic, French, Polish, Romanian. This and more. My grandmothers, whom I mentioned earlier, worked in those years as librarian at the Arbeiterring in Tel Aviv. I often accompanied her to work as a little girl. This is actually the place and the table where she worked. And I remember vividly the literary evenings held there. I remembered eager writers introducing their new books, playwrights with their scripts, poets with their verses, essayists with their articles, political activists with their ideologies and pamphlets. It was a vibrant parade of cultural creativity viewed by a large and eager audience, and none of it was in Hebrew. Who were those people? What was the multi-layered cultural and organizational world in which they lived, dreamed, and created? What were the challenges facing their dreams? Why was their contribution absent from Israel's cultural history? This question led me to my research. Since no comprehensive survey existed to map out the multifaceted nature of Yiddish culture in Israel, across its high and low, elite and popular expressions, my first task was to compile it, to assemble a list of key institutions, to characterize cultural agents and audiences, and to document organizations, movements, and outputs. In short, I prepared the lost part of Israel's cultural history, which I knew existed. I wrote it from a counter-hegemonic perspective, that of Israeli Yiddish culture. For example, I delved into the Yiddish-Israeli press, reviewing them issue by issue, from those published in the early days of the state until the Six-Day War, which marks a significant change in their attitude towards the Israeli ethos due to the euphoric nationalism it incited. I also researched personal archives of Yiddish writers and cultural activists, memoirs, publications of various cultural and social organizations, and of course, the prose works themselves, works that had not received academic attention prior to my research, such as those of Mendelman, Yitzhak Perlov, Yechiel Granatstein, and others. Having compiled a sort of canon of such works, I decided to focus on prose rather than poetry. This was done first and foremost so as to dispel the erroneous and influential view that the Holocaust marks the end of Yiddish as a language in which modern and innovative culture is being written. Unlike the poet's condensed emotional expression, descriptions of everyday experiences, such as the prosaic speech act, can hardly be written successfully in a dead language. Overly compressed, cryptic, and aesthetically heightened situations, especially those in which aesthetic values come at the expense of straightforward expressions of daily experiences, are thus avoided. Not because they are regarded as uninteresting, but in an effort to bring to the fore, as much as it is possible at all within the frame of artistic expression, straightforward and immediate experiences and encounters of ordinary people with the geography and society of their newly established yet mythical promised land. The aim, then, was to delineate the impact of such an encounter of the writer's senses of identity and to investigate the portrait of the land and its people that was implied by the portrayals of the viewpoints of those who were regarded as others by the Israeli absorbing society. Why is the perspective of literature written by Yiddish-speaking Holocaust survivors in Israel vital for Jewish cultural history? Allow me to try and provide a few words about the more general context of my study. On the eve of World War II, about 4 out of 5 Jews worldwide were of Eastern European descent. The vast majority of them spoke Yiddish, whether as their primary language or alongside another, as was common among American Jews. After the Holocaust, most survivors who gathered in Europe chose to come to Israel, roughly 2/3 of them, totaling between 400,000 to 500,000 people. This meant that in the first 5 years of Israel, during the period of mass migration, there were practically more newcomers than veterans. Approximately 650,000 veterans and approximately 750,000 new arrivals. About 70% of them, of those new arrivals, were Holocaust survivors from Europe. Even by the early 1960s, about a quarter of Jewish Israeli citizens spoke Yiddish, a quarter largely overlapping the first, but not completely covering it, were Holocaust survivors. Yiddish-speaking Holocaust survivors were therefore not a marginal voice in Israel cultural scene. They could not have been. The scholarly assumption regarding this significantly large group, sometimes stated outright in the learned literature, sometimes lurking in the margins of the richer research framework, was that they integrated quickly into the dominant culture and simply became part of it. This reflects two primary biases in canonical research on mass migration to Israel: the bias in source materials and the bias of the narrator's perspective. In short, studies on mass migration to Israel relied almost exclusively on sources from the absorbing institutions, written, of course, in Hebrew, and not from the texts produced by the immigrants themselves in their own languages. The focus of these sources was nearly always on the physical and logistical aspects of the absorbing institutions. Mass migrators were a problem to be solved, and their culture was a challenge to be reckoned with. Yet those Yiddish-speaking survivors came to Israel, bringing with them a rich and varied modern culture and hopes for its future. They saw themselves as part of a long-standing tradition that represented, until the war, the beating heart of Jewish creativity worldwide, and was sustained by an intricate networks of cultural centers across the world. These survivors, whom I term Olei Sherit HaPleta, hope to continue their tradition, to belong to it, and to develop it in their new home. Unlike the Zionism of the absorbing establishment, their Zionism did not demand from them to sever their umbilical cord to their past. The loss they experienced during the war added a thick layer of moral obligation to this sentiment. They did not only wish to cherish their connection with their past, they felt morally obliged to do so. They expected Israel to function not only as their safe haven in the material sense, they expected it to become a Noah arch of their cultural treasures and spirit. Avram Sutzkever, the great Yiddish poet and the editor of the literary journal The Golden Age, articulate his belief that the cultural and spiritual revival was an inseparable part of the physical and national revival of Jewish people. He wrote, "Es ist gewesen mein innenwenigster Gläuben, als zusammen mit dem Volksaufkommen und Aufgang auf der altheimischer Erde muss euch aufklingen das jiddische Wort und die Oisies Porchos, beleidigte, versmalierte, was tragen sich zu uns von die Scheitern in Europa, müssen da gefinnen sehr heim, sehr ticken. Ich sehe das Wunderlichste von Eretz-Israel in dem noch anandigen Überleben die Wirklichkeit von Trias Ametim. Nicht in symbolischen Sinnen, nur Bafoel Mamisch. Nicht in Teutentoll von Majdanek sind aufgestanden die Mesim, nur in Lebenstoll von Emek Israel. Aber Trias Amesim von dem Volk Israel, in dem Land Israel, kann sich nicht und will sich nicht benugnen, bloß mit physischen Wiederaufleb, bloß mit der Kibbutz Galues, was wird gemossen und gerechnet mit Ziffern. Man darf euch bringen die Triat Amesimdigkeit von jüdischen Geist, die Kultur äußeres von unser größten Volk, wo sie zersplittert in all die Fremdenischen. This was my deepest belief that alongside the revival of the people and its return to the old land, the Yiddish word must also ring out, and the soaring letters, injured, scorched, carried over to us from the pioneer Europe, must find their home here, the reparation. I see the greatest wonder of the land of Israel in the ongoing survival of the reality of the resurrection of the dead. Not in the symbolic sense, but in actual fact. It is not in the valley of death of Majdanek that the dead rose up from the grave, but in the Yisrael valley, the valley of life. But the resurrection of the Jewish people in its land cannot and does not wish to amount only to the physical revival, a mere ingathering of the exile measured and counted in numbers. We must also bring over the quality of the resurrection of the Jewish spirit, the cultural treasures of our great people, which have been scattered to all foreign corners. Such insights and similar ones led me to realize that before I could describe and analyze literary works, I need to lay out the historical and cultural context from which they emerged. My book's first part was therefore historical. It narrated the establishment and development of Yiddish cultural institutions in budding Israel. The second part unfolds a literary analysis of the prose works written at these cultural institutions and an assessment of the place of such works in overall Israeli culture as well as overall Yiddish culture. Consider, for example, the best-known symbol of secular Hebrew-speaking Israel, Tel Aviv. The historical fact of the matter was that Eastern European Jewry that arrived in Israel after the Holocaust established a surprisingly vibrant cultural center there. Chapter 1 of my book tells its story. It illuminates the uniqueness of the center in comparison to similar Yiddish cultural centers established around the world, both before and after the Holocaust. It provides a portrait of its intelligentsia, its public, and the special conditions that awaited them in Israel. It also includes a cultural history of its major institutions and evaluates their accomplishments. It tells the story of the daily newspaper, Letzte Neues, the literary periodical, Die Goldene Kate, and the Bund's monthly Lebensfragen, and the major libraries and leading publishing houses, Yud Lamed Peretz Verlag, HaMenorah, and Israel Buch. It also tells the story of the individuals who established and headed these enterprises, Avram Sutzkever, Mordechai Tzanin, Yuda Tusky, and others. Chapter 2 of my book offers a history of Israeli Yiddish-speaking surviving remnants modes of Holocaust memorialization. the rituals of homemaking by means of institutionalization of its memory, and their efforts to achieve national recognition of their rituals, commemorating their joint traumas. It describes their cooperation with Landsmannschaften, hometown association around the world, and how they shaped their new national identity with the help of their newly formed modes of remembrance. Chapter 3 introduces the literary traditions which influences and shapes post-Holocaust Yiddish writers and the unique context that awaited them in Israel. It surveys the themes and tension characteristic to modern Yiddish literature until the Holocaust. I read the works of Sholem Aleichem, Peretz, Bergelson, Manger, and others in an attempt to understand and contextualize the unique challenges that those who sought to continue this literary tradition after the Holocaust faced. For example, perhaps the most prominent characteristic of modern Jewish literature from its beginnings was the gaze backwards. Literary depictions of a manifold of expressions to the inevitable dissolution of the old Jewish world in the face of modernity. This inexorable decline of the old world drew a wide variety of responses, from the comic to the nostalgic, and from the avant-garde to conservatism. The Holocaust, which was, in an obvious sense, the most monstrous manifestation of modernity, brutally obliterated the old world, sealing its fate. It therefore restricted the range of literary expression of that gaze backward. Writers who wish to express the vastness of their loss while continuing writing on that theme as part of their loyalty to their literary tradition found it necessary to reevaluate the range of artistic possibilities at their disposal. They sought to represent the past in a credible manner without sinking into nostalgic mourning, to evoke the memory without lapsing into the monotony of melancholic lament, and without replacing the joy of discovery and creative endeavor with petrified conservatism. For these writers, an answer to their quandaries seemed to be the act of depicting their experiences in Israel, of representing their immediate present, the encounter with Israel, the human, geographical, and environmental landscape of their country. This choice, which I have termed the Israeli theme in Yiddish literature, has had fascinating communal implications and interesting artistic results. It enabled writers to process their past memories out of what was undoubtedly a most positive outlook of their new surroundings, an enthusiastic embrace of their present, and an evaluation of the possibilities that their future holds for them. They gazed upon the country's landscape and people as refugees and as survivors, and they therefore gave expression to their loss even as they went about describing the new and exciting. Chapter 4 is the final chapter of my book and the book's core for those whose main interest is literature. It is devoted to an analysis of representative example of Yiddish prose dealing with Israel in all of its form, the novel, novella, short story, and the satirical journalistic feuilleton. It is the first attempt to survey and analyze this unique body of literature. The prose describes the survivors' encounter with some of Israel's typical sites of the 1950s and 1960s. The deserted Palestinian village, the Ma'abara, the transit camp, the government housing project for new immigrants, the kibbutz, and the city, Tel Aviv. The chapter is an attempt to answer the following questions. How did Yiddish writing in Israel develop and extend the literary tradition to which it belonged? How did Holocaust survivors contend with the tension between mythical conception of Israel and the reality of daily life in their new country? How did they characterize the expression of being at home, of having a home country? Do the before mentioned Israel sites expand the characteristic split in modern Yiddish literature between the Jewish shtetl and the city? Or do they confirm and abide by its rules? Such questions guide the close readings I present. In order to assess the innovative character of the literature discussed there, it is compared with Yiddish works written prior to the Holocaust on the one hand, and contemporary Hebrew literature on the other hand, such as Samech Ezar, Moshe Shamir, Judith Handel, and more. The chapter emphasizes the importance of launching and encouraging a comparative study of Israeli literature as such, that is, a study of all literary works written in Israel in any language. Such a study would complement studies that overlap it partially, such as Hebrew literature, Yiddish literature, or Arabic literature. It's impossible to conclude without giving you a taste of the works themselves. I've chosen a piece that delves into the charge and counter between a Holocaust survivors living in a depopulated Palestinian village and a Palestinian attempting to return to his home, at least so as to observe it once more, to observe what had happened to it. I selected this imagined meeting because it touches on a wound that remains fresh and raw even today, although more than 70 years have passed since the events it depicts. In a verlost dorf in a deserted village from 1944 was the first long work of literature by Mendelman that Mendelman wrote that deals entirely with life in Israel. The novel tells the story of Moine, a Holocaust survivor who was uprooted from his native village in Poland by the war, and describes his attempts to put down roots in post-independent Israel. In an abandoned village named Givat HaMisgad, Mosque Hill, where he was sent along with many other Olei She'erit HaPleta upon her arriving in Israel. He is a refugee who was forced by the war to abandon his village in Poland, and is also a refugee who finds his new home in Israel by virtue of another's refugeehood. Moine had hoped to start his life anew in the recently established Israel. He sought to be Adam, first man, in a promised land, a Garden of Eden. But his past prevents this, and not only his own past, but also the one of the place where he arrived, the village in which he was settled. Thus, this is a broken ideal, which seeks once again to return to being an ideal. Is such a return possible? The story is built and developed on an analogy between two abandoned villages, the Jewish Polish one and the Palestinian, with the image of the Garden of Eden hovering above them. And so he writes, news spread throughout the street that there was an Arab in the village. People gathered at the water throw. An Arab, an Arab. One waved his hand and said, what is upon you people? Have you never before seen a shape of a man? He is like all men, a woman added. Why has he come? Why has nothing to do with this? Is he not allowed? Of course he is allowed, but maybe, suggested someone, he used to live in this alley, and his longings to have another look got the better of him? Leave the man alone, go away, said a brown-eyed woman. The woman was overcome with sadness. Here she stands in the middle of the market on a Sunday, just like this old man, propped up against the wall. A crowd around her. Hey, Ludzie, a Jewish woman. No, Bratuk, you are wrong. A one of us. One of us? A Polish woman? Scolding glances from the crowd pierced her body, tearing her apart with their demand for an answer. One moment and she's lost. She leaped up from her place, her almond eyes filled with fury, with hatred. She shoved her Aryan papers in their eyes. What are you doing there, people? Let him sit, let him be. She went and brought bread from her home. Take, Grandpa, take it, she pleaded. These residents of the alley shook their head in sadness and thought, is it possible that I live under his roof? And they comforted themselves and said, I did not drive him away. Nobody drove him away. They left of their own will. And one man said, what if a Jew come to one of their villages? The speaker waited for a concurring response, but all remained silent. And there was one who looked upon the Arab with suspicion and fury. His eyes, his hands, his broad frame seemed to say to the people, stop your gazing and your nonsense. He must be expelled, the old folks. Let him get the hell out of here, the stranger with the kafia. The passage expresses two main voices. One is a deep identification with the Palestinian refugee, and the other is a resistance to this identification. The resistance to the Jewish refugees' identification stemmed from the shock at the possibility that they might have to be uprooted again. And for that reason, they regarded the Palestinian as a threat. He poses not only a concrete threat to their right to the place in which they currently live, but also a metaphysical threat to the very possibility of putting down roots without expelling another. On the one hand, their suffering is too great to contain the suffering of the Palestinian refugee. On the other hand, more than anyone else, they, refugees from the worst of all wars, understand his predicament. Whether or not they want to, they are his brothers in refugeehood. This is how the narrator sums up this sad encounter between the Jewish refugees and the Palestinian refugee, a meeting loaded with equal measures of compassion and shame, and with the heavy load of the limited ability to contain the pain of the other. The Jews from the alley returned to their homes with a great sadness in their heart, an anxiety that stirred up silent memories, both passive and active. A wheel is spun, the wheel of human destiny. It whirled at a dizzying speed. Home intact, then homelessness, destruction, foreign lands, distances, ships on the seas, and once again, an intact home. Now they felt, for the first time, that this is not the fate of Jews alone, but the fate of human beings in general, of nations, of the whole world. Yiddish literature in Israel is the closing chapter in the annals of modern Yiddish literature. It is also a significant part of one of the opening chapters in the story of Israeli literature. My book is an attempt to write the former, and by doing so, to begin a rewriting of the latter. The body of works documented and discussed in it reveals a rich and complex literature written from the specific point of view of refugees who arrived to a new and yet ancient homeland, where they were embraced as well as rejected, where they felt both alienated and accepted. It served for them as a complex symbol of destruction and revival. Thank you. Adank.
Wow, Adan, indeed, golly. I'm just going to do this for a second. I'm just going to invite people in the webinar to put questions in the Q&A section of our screen. And I just have a few comments. And I was really grateful that you included the extended analysis of Mendelmann's work, no relation, I should say. Because so first of all, I think it's just really exemplary of the just wonderful close readings that you provide in this book. And I think it's interesting. I asked you about this, like sort of to teach a course that would pair kind of canonical Israeli Hebrew novels or prose fiction with some of this Yiddish prose fiction that you're bringing into translation for the first time. I think it would just be really interesting, and it would really, you can see how the Yiddish provides what you call a counter narrative in a really interesting way. And so one of the places where this happens, obviously, is as you describe in the book, is around the description of the Palestinian landscape. And, this, what you call just now shame and compassion, sort of compassion for the refugee, but also kind of revulsion and fear because if they return, well, then I need to go, that kind of thing. And so, the writer that sort of came to mind for me when I was reading those sections of that long chapter on Israeli spaces is Avot Yeshurun, who's a poet.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me that he's one of the Israeli Hebrew writers that comes closest to that kind of shame and compassion. And also, in his poetry, he has, of course, his poetry about Tel Aviv, which is all about walking around Tel Aviv with his shtetl like on his back, in this kind of palimpsestic image. So, and in his work, and in the poetry itself. So he comes to Palestine in 1925 as Yechiel Perlmutter and reinvents himself as Avot Yeshurun, but there's a lot of Yiddish in the work, and then later also some Arabic. And so it seemed to me that was the figure that he was in my mind as you were, as I was reading your analysis of the sort of Yiddish writing refugees encounter with these Palestinian figures. So that's sort of one thing maybe to think about. And then in relation to that is I loved what you did with Judith Hendel. I just have to read that out loud. So this is, if you have the book, it's on page 202 and 203. So Judith Hendel is, a canonical Hebrew writer, and she's kind of credited with being the first Hebrew prose fiction writer to give voice to this population of Holocaust survivors in a collection of stories called Anashim Acherim Hem. They are other kind of people. And in particular, one story with that title. And and you talk about this story and the encounter there. And I think, your reading of it is just kind of both really obvious and also sort of brilliant. Why didn't anybody say this before? That when they speak broken Yiddish, they're not really speaking broken Yiddish. It's just because to the Hebrew ear, that language has to appear broken. So this notion that let me see if I can get this right. The Hebrew writers are sort of orientalizing their Yiddish peers and othering them as a way of propping themselves up because they are nervous and they are anxious and they are new. And just one more bit here, the other novel that came to mind to me, and this is just to say that I think that this work, it's about representation of Israeli experience in Yiddish prose, but it's really about modern Jewish literature writ large. And so this question of multilingualism and how language is depicted, how language is represented in text, the great novel Call It Sleep by Henry Roth, which is a pre-war novel, But in that book, we find also the representation of the different languages of the American Jewish immigrant experience. In this case, English, Polish, Yiddish, and Hebrew when he goes to Cheder, when David goes to Cheder. But the Yiddish is presented in this very high, elevated. So the book is in English, but the Yiddish is represented as this really elevated, almost Shakespearean, because that's how good their Yiddish is. And the broken language is actually English. So I wondered, if there's a place where we can find that broken Hebrew equivalent in Yiddish fiction. Do you see what I'm saying? It's like a real echo chamber, but it's just a kind of it's an interesting look back. And finally, I just have to say, and this is again sort of in relation to how I think your book really offers like a kind of a titanic corrective to modern Jewish fiction writ large, globally, which is to demonstrate what Israeli Yiddish prose does with Yiddish prose written in Europe. And so the figure of Bergelsen, who, as you say, sort of maps that look backward, is always a geographic, kind of mapping between the center, the provincial center, and the shtetl, or the metropole and the shtetl, and the movement between them. And so the movement of enlightenment, of possibly of Jewish enlightenment, is always from the shtetl to the metropole, and then that look back with regret or even nostalgia. And so in the moment in your book where you sort of say, oh, Jaffa is the shtetl and Tel Aviv is the metropole, and yet Tel Aviv gets kind of this. So there's just this wonderfully complicated thing, I think, that happens in your analysis. And I just wanted the audience to know that it's not just about Israeli prose fiction, but it really is about Jewish modernity and how Jewish modernity is represented across, across in a kind of a global world literature sense. I'm going to give you a chance just to respond if you want to any of that. And I'm also
yes, I would love to.
If you'd like to. Yes, please.
I think that it's very interesting what you said about Bergelsen, and thank you for mentioning that. I think that Yiddish literature was looking for the young hero, because Bergelsen tried to portray few of the young heroes in his novels, and specifically I offered a reading of Noch Alleman, and the young people there, the heroine and her friends, were decadent people. And the Yiddish and another famous young man that we find in Yiddish literature is of course Sholem Aleichem, with the Motel and his close friends and family. But where is the next young hero or heroine? Where does it grow, specifically after the Holocaust? It seems that in Yiddish literature, the point of view of the narrator goes specifically with the fathers, right?
Yes.
And it's very kind of a old perspective, and there's a thirst to find the young new hero. And I think that what's very, very interesting in the Yiddish Israeli literature, that it offered such a character, such a hero.
The refugee, in that new refugee. Yeah.
Right. And it's very, very different from from the portrait of the young character that was offered by the Hebrew literature, the Sabra, the one who was born from the seas and from the sand, that had no history and no connection to the Goles, to Europe. And here we can see the portrait of young men and women who are loaded with their past, and it's very interesting to see what they are doing with that past. Judith Handel, for example, when I was reading her work, her story, I was very, very surprised to find that Anashim Acherim הם, they are different people. I thought that she was going to talk about the Yiddish-speaking heroes, but I was very surprised to, yeah, that she's actually talking about the Sabras and the young Yiddish-speaking characters that she portrayed, looks at them with fascination and with and this is not the way that that young people looked at Sabras in the Yiddish literature. If they all looked at them, because the Sabras weren't so dominant in the Yiddish prose written in Israel. They were there as babies, as their children, in which they had a lot of hopes that they will raise as others, but not as the Sabras that are portrayed in the Hebrew Israeli literature.
I'm gonna, there's one question here in the chat, and I'm gonna kind of ask it, but also expand it a little bit, if that's okay. So someone wanted you to comment on the animosity of the Israeli establishment to both Yiddish and Holocaust survivors. And I wanted also to say, I appreciated at one point you sort of say, well, they're refugees and they're survivors. And actually refugees are the dominant group, and survivors numerically are, they're less, but they get kind of more attention,
right,
because their experience is understood as more difficult. And I think that, you can see that in a lot of writing about the Holocaust, where the sort of that first generation, the survivor of the camps is kind of considered that primary, quote unquote, authentic source, and then widening circles out from that, depending upon where you were during the war, what you did, how you got out. And so do you want to comment on some of I thought those distinctions were really important. It's all under the umbrella of Yiddish, but they're important, maybe subcategories.
Yes. Well, it was very complicated, because on the one hand, the survivors and refugees themselves, they were Zionist. Hagit Lavsky coined this term of spontaneous Zionists. I mean, even people that weren't so Zionist before the Holocaust understood that they better that the national identity is important, and they adopted it. So they came to Israel, and Israel was very appealing for them, and they wanted to be part of the Israeli hegemony. And but on the other hand, they wanted to retain their culture, and they even, as I said in the presentation, they had a moral obligation to do so. And so yes, the Israeli, for example, the Israeli newspaper, the Yiddish newspaper, Let's Tenayes, fought for something like 10 years to grant a permission to be published. Mordechai Tsanin did a brilliant take. He got a permission to publish his newspaper for 3 times a week, and so he established another daily newspaper for the other three days of the week, and so he printed them day in, day out, and he published a novel in sequent novel day in, day out, so it will become one newspaper. Yes, I think the establishment was trying to make a melting pot, and the fact that there were so many Holocaust survivors, refugees coming from Eastern Europe wasn't helping to that process. So they tried to ban them from doing so. But what they did, and this is what I describe in the second chapter of the book, they took the monies that they had as Holocaust survivors, and they purified it by investing in culture, in their culture.
That's
And
beautiful.
so when I started my research, we thought that there were a lot of Yizkor Bichar were printed in the publishing houses, but we discovered that there weren't so many. The publishing houses were making a living from printing books, from prose and poetry and all kinds of books in Yiddish, of course. So it was a very vibrant scene going there, although it was banned by the authorities. So they weren't allowed to print a daily newspaper and to have theater, but it changed around 1958. Something like that.
Okay, I'm going to go into you could talk about Eichmann also if you want, but I thought, but let me ask this from the chat, and I'm going to again expand on it. Somebody asked about the title, I Am Your Dust, and I've read the book, so I don't know where it comes from, but maybe you'll talk about that for a minute.
Yes.
And also this term, Ole Sherita Plita, which is your term, and you use it, you bring it, and then you stick to it. So tell us about that term and why that term is important historiographically for you.
Okay, so I'm Your Dust comes from Manger's poem, which that became like a hymn. It was published in the beginning of the 1950s, but it was considered to be a hymn that was supposedly written for the 10 years anniversary of Israel. But no, he wrote it beforehand. And he describes in this poem his imagined arrival to Israel. And he said, I will not kiss your sands, and he refers to Yuda Levi's Libi B'Mizrach, my heart is in the east, and of course of his song that it's a very Zionist song. And so Manger offers another perspective of the Zionism, and I felt that this depicts the point of view of these Holocaust survivors, and so I chose this phrase to be to be. I was very, very touched by this song, and actually I was hearing it while driving to Jerusalem during the 4 year of my doctoral studies. So it was like a nice reminder of that time. Olei Sherita Pleta, it's a very chimeric kind of combination, because from the one hand they were survivors, Sherita Pleta, and from the other hand there were
remnants of the refugees.
Yes, remnants of the refugees, and they had a very firm identity as the last that were remained. And so as the last that were remained, we have an obligation to continue this tradition that and this culture that we brought. But on the same hand, there were Zionists, most of them. Even the Bundists were very confused with their obligation to this new enterprise of Israel, and they are a very, very special and interesting case inside in this realm of Yiddish culture in Israel, because they were really, from the one hand, they had a national identity, but on the other hand, they weren't nationalists, and they were opposing Zionism as it was. But they also were Olei Sherit HaPleta, in the sense that they were coming here with the mission. They could go to other places, but they chose to come here. And it was in these very specific times frame between 1948 and 1967, this was a very complex and interesting times to live here. And they were a part of the building of Israel and Israel
I have one
culture.
last question.
Mhm.
Time still. I loved sort of the Yizkor, but in relation to Shikun Lita, like I kept
Yeah.
thinking of like Lita as a book or Shikun Lita as like all of this, you know, you mentioned at the very beginning our shared interests in the relation between space and memory. And so it was very vivid for me. And I wondered if you maybe wanted to take this opportunity to say a little bit about your newer Yizkor, your memorial book project, what you're writing now, what you're working on now. Because it definitely comes out of, you know, the very
Yes.
those early chapters of the books where you really look at sort of institutional culture and the newspapers and the libraries, and then you shift to the housing developments and the street names. And so I felt like there was a lot there, and I wondered how that is shaping the new work.
So my new work on Yizkor Becher is I try to discover how do you make an ethos, what connects people, how can memory connects people. And so I delve into a few Yizkor Becher, and first I had to make order and to find out, okay, what are Yizkor Becher, because we have a lot of memorial books, and not every memorial book is a Yizkor Becher. So what is an Yizkor Becher? And to understand the difference between history and literature, because it all connects, right? We have descriptions of Shalom Aleichem that describes the city. So what is this? Is this a literary depiction of a Jewish town? Is it a ethos of a Jewish town or a Jewish identity? And what is the difference between the depiction of a certain town and when Sholem Aleichem does that, or Mendele Mechor Sfarim does that? So yes, I try to go to the big names, of the main Yizkor Becher, and to see how do they work, what do they do. Except of commemorating, of course, their immediate goals and matters. Yes, and in the Shikun Litais was a very moving one. Actually, I was visiting there a few weeks ago because my late Yiddish teacher, Esther Ruzhansky, was living not far away from there. And it's a very interesting way to see how the culture is making a space. And here in Israel, it was a very we had a lot of opportunities to do so, because the space was built at these years, and so not like other places of Jewish communities in other places where the space was already built. What is significance in 1967? Well, 1967 is the year of the Six-Day War, and then I felt that there's a change in the way in the Jewish identity that was made here, created here in Israel. I thought it was the end. It's the beginning of the end of the Jewish and the Yiddish liberal and Jewish liberal identity, and the beginning of another identity, which is more religious and conservative, more religious and more nationalistic.
Yeah, go ahead.
by 1967, those Holocaust survivors were already become Israeli citizens, and their children were already becoming, they were Sabras, and they were Israelis, and there was a decline of the ethos and the values of the modern secular Yiddish culture here in Israel, and maybe not just here.
Not just there. Okay. Thank you so much, Gali. It was
Thank
just
you.
a total pleasure. And I urge everyone to find a copy of this book and to read it and enjoy it and learn from it. And thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon or this evening, for wherever you are, near and far. I'm jealous of the people in Paris, but hey, that's